If you thought the Diddy saga couldn't get any messier, think again, because the moment Netflix dropped The Reckoning, Sean Combs went into full panic mode, firing off cease-and-desist letters like confetti at a Meltdown parade. And the funniest part? The documentary didn't drag him. He dragged himself, frame by frame, with receipts even his legal team couldn't spin clean. From the moment that first episode hit, every mask he's worn for the last 3 decades started slipping all at once, and it is not a pretty sight. Stay with me, because the deeper you go into this doc, the more you realize Diddy isn't afraid of the public. He's terrified of the judges who might watch it next. If you're still with me, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Fame Insight is sprinting toward 10,000, and you're here at the perfect moment. Tap in, stay locked, and don't miss the truth they keep trying to silence. Netflix didn't just release a documentary, they detonated a cultural bomb, and the shockwave hasn't stopped since. Diddy: The Reckoning opened with the kind of footage that makes you sit up straight before the title card even appears. The interviews, the receipts, the stories from people who spent years inside his orbit. The entire thing plays out like someone finally decided to stop protecting an empire built on charm, fear, and myth. From the first 2 minutes, you can feel the air shift because this isn't a hit job. This is a room full of people who knew him at his highest, lowest, and most unfiltered moments, finally telling the parts of the story the industry never wanted public. And while viewers are trying to process the chaos, Diddy is somewhere pacing rooms and speed-dialing lawyers, convinced that reputation repairs and courtroom dreams are slipping out of his hands. What really makes this moment powerful is how the documentary refuses to tell you what to think. It lays out the voices, the patterns, the contradictions, and you're left stitching together a picture that looks nothing like the glossy image he spent decades forcing the world to accept. Netflix didn't need dramatic music or exaggerated narration. The truth delivered enough impact on its own. Stay with me, because once we unpack why Diddy is scrambling to erase this doc from the planet, things only get more revealing. What really set this documentary apart wasn't just the pace or the editing, it was the lineup of voices finally stepping out of the shadows. The moment Eric Sermon started speaking, the tone shifted. He didn't come in swinging or performing for the camera. He spoke with the kind of quiet certainty you only get from someone who watched far more than they ever planned to. His account didn't rely on embellishment. It relied on familiarity, the kind that forms when you've seen a person operate up close, before the fame calcified into myth. Then came Kina, whose past loyalty to Diddy made her shift even more jarring. Hearing her describe the pressure, the control, and the slow erosion of her own instincts felt like watching someone unpack a box they sealed a decade ago and pretended didn't exist. Her tone wasn't bitter. It was relieved, almost like finally telling the truth, freed her from carrying a story she never volunteered to protect. And right when you thought the documentary had reached peak intensity, Kurt Burrowes appeared and pushed the entire narrative into another dimension. Kurt wasn't emotional, and he wasn't guessing. He spoke like a man reviewing the receipts of a career spent too close to someone whose charm always had sharp edges. His account made one thing clear: the version of Diddy the public held onto wasn't the version people inside his orbit experienced. Kurt didn't expose a rumor, he exposed a pattern. If you're still with me, stay locked in, because once these insiders opened their mouths, the real unraveling began. Kurt Burrowes didn't enter the conversation like a witness. He entered like a man finally tired of carrying the weight everyone else pretended not to notice. His words didn't wobble, didn't drift, didn't sound like someone testing a story. They hit with the kind of steady force you hear from someone who's been holding the truth so long it carved a dent in his conscience. As a co-founder of Bad Boy, someone who sat close enough to see the gears turning behind the curtain, Kirk's account wasn't gossip. It was a first-hand glimpse into a world the industry spent years wrapping in myth. And when he described witnessing that explosive moment between Diddy and his mother, the entire tone of the conversation shifted. This wasn't an outsider speculating. This was a man who helped build the empire, standing there saying, "Here's the part you weren't supposed to know." What made Kirk's voice land so sharply wasn't just the incident he described, it was the implication baked beneath it. If someone with that level of proximity saw something so intense, who else saw what they never said? How many stories were left on the cutting room floor of history because people were too afraid to speak, too invested to disrupt the machine, or too conditioned to believe that this kind of behavior was simply the cost of proximity to power? Kirk's disclosure cracked the veneer. It forced everyone watching to confront the uncomfortable idea that silence wasn't absence, it was strategy. But the moment he finished, something strange happened. Instead of grappling with what he revealed, a different conversation started taking shape, one that didn't question the behavior he described, but questioned him for describing it. The shift was quick, almost rehearsed, like people were more disturbed by the timing than the truth itself, and that reaction said more about the industry's priorities than any documentary ever could. Stay with me, because the next part exposes exactly how that pivot happened, and who stepped up to steer the narrative away from the one question nobody wanted to ask. The moment Diddy realized the documentary wasn't just a bad press day but a full-blown narrative collapse, his legal team started firing off cease-and-desist letters like confetti. Not because the doc exaggerated, twisted, or manipulated anything, but because it did the one thing his circle never expected. It showed him without the costume, no PR gloss, no choreographed charm, just the raw footage, the old recordings, and the pattern he spent decades convincing people didn't exist. And when a legacy built on image starts cracking, panic becomes the new strategy. Netflix didn't fold, they didn't tremble, they didn't even blink. Because once a documentary crosses into global phenomenon, there's no pulling it back. This wasn't a small expose on a niche channel. This was the #1 documentary worldwide, the kind that spreads faster than a scandal in a group chat, the kind watched by judges, lawyers, commentators, old collaborators, new critics, and every person who ever said, "Something about this man never sat right with me." Diddy's cease and desist wasn't damage control. It was desperation disguised as legal language. And here's the part that gnaws at him. The exposure isn't coming from angry exes or bitter rivals. It's coming from people who built the empire with him, people who knew the early days, people who saw what the public never did. When insiders speak, the story hits different. When the footage backs them up, the story becomes undeniable. And when the world watches it unfold in real time, there's no attorney sharp enough to unring that bell. Diddy isn't worried about the public. He's worried about the people who matter behind closed doors. The appeals court, the political circles, the institutions he once believed he could charm. He knows they're streaming the documentary too. He knows every recorded meltdown, every exposed tactic, every testimony hits harder when it's playing on a screen instead of being whispered in a hallway. He knows the documentary didn't just damage his image, it obliterated the fantasy he was hoping to sell. And that's why the cease and desist letters flew out so quickly. Not because the documentary lied, but because it told the truth too clearly. It connected dots he spent years scattering. It revealed motives he thought were buried. It painted a portrait he can't control, edit, reshape, or deny. And for a man who built his world on narrative power, losing control of the storyline is the one thing he can't handle. Still with me? Good. Because the fallout from those letters wasn't the end of the chaos. It was the beginning of the unraveling. The moment the conversation shifted toward Diddy's appeal, the entire situation snapped into focus. This wasn't about pride, reputation, or even the documentary's accuracy. This was strategy. The legal system doesn't weigh guilt during an appeal. It weighs procedure, technicalities, rulings, timing, instructions. And Diddy knows that. His lawyers know that. Anyone watching the courtroom closely knows that. So when his team started firing off cease and desist warnings like confetti, it wasn't random panic. It was a controlled attempt to manage perception before it reached anyone wearing a robe. Because even though judges aren't supposed to be influenced by public opinion, they're human. They read headlines, they hear whispers, and they don't forget a cultural earthquake once it hits the ground. That's what has Diddy rattled. The Netflix doc isn't just a trending title. It's a global event, a collective viewing that turns his entire history into a cautionary tale. When a story travels that far, that fast, it stops being entertainment and becomes part of the public consciousness. And the last thing Diddy wants is a judiciary that already sat through his trial, now sitting through his past. Even if those details aren't directly admissible, they color the air around the case. They frame him before anyone speaks. They strip away the sympathetic image he tried to build during the trial. The soft voice, the curated clips, the staged moments meant to sell humility. That facade evaporates the second people watch footage of him directing his world like a puppet master who never expected the camera to turn. The deeper issue is how clearly the documentary demolishes the defense narrative. It doesn't need dramatic narration or sensational edits. Diddy provides the damning moments himself, his tone, his posture, his control over every room he enters, his manipulation of media, his influence over platforms. The doc lays those patterns bare, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. Suddenly the trial strategies, the courtroom demeanor, the polished statements, they all look like performance pieces from someone who assumed the world would play along forever. That's why the appeal feels fragile before it even begins. Not because of legal flaws, but because the cultural tide shifted too far, too fast for him to swim against it. The documentary didn't just add context, it obliterated the illusion that his past could remain compartmentalized, tucked away behind nostalgia and influence. And with that illusion gone, the appeal isn't a legal process, it's a desperate attempt to outrun the image people finally see. And here's the twist that makes this section land exactly where it needs to. Diddy isn't fighting Netflix because of misinformation. He's fighting them because for the first time he's not the narrator of his own story. His version of events isn't the default anymore. The world no longer sees him through the lens he spent decades polishing. And once that control slips, the entire empire he built on image management begins to crumble. Are you with me? Good, because what comes next shows exactly how far he went to rewrite his legacy before the documentary exposed the version he hoped would never surface. Diddy has always operated inside a system that rewarded his influence and punished anyone who questioned it, and the Netflix documentary finally forced that long-protected machinery into the light. For years, everyone saw the same patterns: the control, the manipulation, the orbit of people who adjusted their behavior the moment he entered a room. And instead of treating those patterns as warnings, the industry treated them like quirks of a successful man, as if power came with a free pass to bulldoze your way through everyone standing too close. That's the real problem. Not just what he did, but how many people accepted it as normal, because speaking up would have shattered their own access. What the documentary exposed wasn't simply the chaos of one man, it was the culture that allowed him to move unchecked through every corridor of influence. You see it in the way insiders suddenly distance themselves, pretending shock at stories they whispered about privately for years. You see it in the journalists who once danced around hard questions, now acting as though they were silenced by some invisible force rather than their own ambition. You see it in the artists who benefited from standing next to him, yet now act like their proximity never came with a cost. It's an entire ecosystem built on the idea that protecting the powerful matters more than protecting the people affected by them. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Diddy didn't just thrive because he was charismatic or talented, he thrived because he understood the system better than anyone else. He knew who needed favors, who feared retaliation, who could be flattered, who could be pressured, and who could be ignored. He used that understanding the way other people use business plans. The documentary didn't create this perception, it simply removed the last layer of polish covering it. Once that mask cracked, the public finally saw what insiders already knew. The silence wasn't accidental, it was built in. Now that the power structure is collapsing, everyone is scrambling to rewrite history, acting like they were helpless bystanders instead of participants who enabled the narrative for years. That's why this moment feels so significant. It's not just about accountability for one man, it's about the collapse of a culture where wealth and status were considered shields against consequences. And the more people speak, the more obvious it becomes that the truth was never hidden. It was just ignored because acknowledging it meant challenging someone the industry wasn't ready to challenge. Still with me? Good. Because the next part reveals what happens when the system built to protect someone finally breaks. And the truth they kept buried doesn't just surface, it floods. The real unraveling begins when you look at how Diddy tried to craft his own redemption arc before the documentary even hit the screen. He wasn't planning a quiet retreat into obscurity. He was plotting a glossy resurrection, the kind of personal rebrand only someone with unlimited confidence and a long history of getting away with things would dare attempt. According to insiders, he gathered mountains of private footage, hired crews, and positioned himself at the center of a self-made doc that was supposed to set the record straight. In his mind, he would walk the audience through his life, sprinkle in a few emotional moments, offer a curated confession here or there, and walk away looking like a misunderstood icon instead of a man cornered by his own history. What makes this plan almost theatrical is how much he underestimated the public's patience. He thought he could frame himself as a complex figure navigating fame, power, and pressure, a creative genius who faced occasional setbacks but always meant well. It was meant to be a controlled narrative, a soft landing. But the Netflix documentary beat him to the punch, and instead of giving him the runway for reinvention, it ripped the curtain off the entire operation. Suddenly, that polished footage stopped looking like transparency and started looking like damage control in slow motion. And here's the part that really exposes how detached he had become from reality. He truly believed audiences would swallow whatever story he handed them, as if people hadn't spent years dissecting celebrity spin tactics. In his world, one well-produced documentary could erase a mountain of accusations, wipe away decades of rumors, and make the public forget every headline that had already shaped his image. He wanted to run a rehabilitation campaign, not a confession, and the footage reflects that. Smiles at the camera, carefully chosen moments, controlled vulnerability, nothing that required accountability. But the documentary changed the terrain entirely. Instead of rolling out his comeback piece, he now watches the world examine him through the lens of people he never expected to speak publicly. His footage lost its purpose. His strategy lost its footing. His attempt to steer the narrative has completely collapsed under the weight of what others revealed. And that's why the cease-and-desist letters flew out so quickly. He wasn't trying to correct inaccuracies. He was trying to stop his carefully constructed redemption from being drowned by a version of himself he couldn't control. Still with me? because the next turn shows exactly why his entire team spiraled once they realized the public wasn't buying the fantasy anymore. What this documentary truly exposes isn't just Diddy's behavior, it's the long, calculated illusion he sold to the public and the industry for decades. He didn't build his image on truth, he built it on access, power, and carefully crafted performances designed to blur the line between the man and the myth. For years, people believed the polished version because he controlled the lens. He understood early how to shape narratives, how to manipulate perception, how to charm an audience with the same precision he used to intimidate the people closest to him. And once you watch the documentary, that pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The irony is almost poetic. The footage that was supposed to rebuild his reputation is the same footage that destroys it. Every clip meant to paint him as misunderstood instead reveals someone who knew exactly how to perform vulnerability without ever actually demonstrating it. You can see the calculation behind the smiles, the curated emotional beats, the half-confessions delivered just soft enough to sound reflective while never truly admitting anything. It's not authenticity, it's strategy. And this time, the strategy backfired. Once you strip away the lighting, the edits, the charm, all that's left is a pattern of behavior that he can't hide behind dancers, producers, or platinum plaques. The documentary did something the industry never had the courage to do. It showed him without the costume, and without the costume, the character collapses. That's why he wants it gone. Not because it lies, but because it finally tells the truth without his approval. And that's the part that terrifies him. When the public sees the full picture, there's no PR team strong enough to protect the storyline he's clung to for years. People aren't judging him on rumors or tabloids anymore. They're judging him based on his own words, his own footage, his own behavior. That's why the cease and desist letters are flying. That's why the panic is showing. This isn't about legal strategy. This is about losing control of a narrative he treated like a possession. The documentary didn't just recount events. It unveiled the machinery behind his entire persona. And once an illusion breaks, it doesn't matter how much money or influence you throw at it. The audience never sees it the same way again. Are you still with me? Because the next part digs into the moment the public realized the performance wasn't brilliance. It was manipulation masquerading as vulnerability. By the time the documentary reaches its final stretch, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Every layer you peel back reveals another version of the same man, the same tactics, the same calculated performances he's been running for decades. And the illusion only cracks harder when you realize he wasn't just manipulating the people around him. He was manipulating the entire ecosystem built to protect him. Judges, reporters, bloggers, fans, insiders, even enemies. Everyone got a curated version of Diddy, perfectly designed to keep the machine running. But now that the curtain's been yanked back, the performance looks sloppy, desperate, and painfully out of date. The world moved on, and he's still handing out the same script he wrote 20 years ago. What makes Section 9 hit with a different weight is how clearly it shows the collapse wasn't sudden, it was slow, quiet erosion, a power structure aging out of usefulness. The arrogance that once felt untouchable now reads like a bad habit he couldn't shake. The tactics that once intimidated the industry now look like a man trying to sprint through quicksand. And as the documentary lays out those final receipts, you can almost feel the immunity evaporating. Not because people suddenly grew brave, but because the shield he relied on finally shattered under its own pressure. And here's the twist. The panic you're seeing now isn't about innocence, it's about image. He knows the public can forgive almost anything except being exposed as the architect of his own downfall. That's why the cease and desist letters flew out like confetti. That's why he's terrified of judges watching it. That's why his team is scrambling to spin the narrative into something softer, cleaner, more flattering. But the documentary doesn't give him that luxury. It shows exactly who he is in his own footage, his own words, his own decisions. No edits needed. By the end, you're left with the one truth the documentary never states directly but makes absolutely clear. This wasn't a fall from grace. It was a long overdue collision with reality, and the impact isn't finished yet. Are you still with me? Good, because the final pieces sliding into place say more than any headline ever could. By the time you reach this point in the story, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Diddy isn't battling public opinion anymore. He's battling his own legacy unraveling in real time. Every attempt to silence the documentary reads like someone trying to glue the cracks back into a vase that already hit the floor. The cease and desist letters aren't confident power moves. They're panic. They signal a man who suddenly realizes the walls he built to protect his image are no longer holding up under the weight of his own history. And that's why this moment feels so different from every other scandal he's waded through over the decades. He's not navigating criticism. He's confronting receipts he can't spin. The footage, the testimonies, the behind-the-scenes stories. They don't rely on public sympathy or shock value. They rely on his own actions speaking louder than the rehearsed charm he spent years projecting. Once the world sees the contradictions, the manipulations, the calculated performance, performances. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle. It's not a PR crisis, it's a reality check. Even more telling is the fear surrounding how judges, politicians, and the broader public might interpret the documentary. Appeals don't operate on emotion, but humans do. And Diddy knows that. He knows that once those images circulate worldwide, once those stories sink in, any notion of a rehabilitation arc evaporates. The documentary isn't just detailing what happened, it's mapping out a pattern that no legal team, no polished statement, and no sudden act of charity can cover. What emerges is a portrait of someone who believed his influence could outpace accountability forever. Someone who thought he could craft a redemption narrative on his own terms and roll it out when it suited him. But narratives get messy when the truth shows up without permission. And now, instead of controlling the story, he's reacting to it, scrambling behind the scenes, watching decades of carefully curated mystique collapse under the weight of people finally speaking openly. The irony is brutal. The very documentary he tried to suppress has become the most widely consumed dismantling of his image to date, and the more he pushes to bury it, the more people watch it. It's a classic case of the cover-up becoming louder than the content itself. The era of charm offensives, strategic alliances, and backstage influence is fading, and he's left confronting a world that no longer buys the myth he spent years selling. If you're still tuned in, stay with me, because the final stretch of this story doesn't soften, it sharpens. For all the noise surrounding this documentary, the loudest truth sits quietly in the background. Diddy's downfall isn't happening because the world suddenly turned against him. It's happening because the world finally stopped shielding him. The cease-and-desist letters he's firing off aren't legal strategy. They're panic dressed in paperwork. When a man who spent decades curating his mythology starts scrambling to erase a narrative he didn't direct, you're watching someone confront a version of himself he can't outspin. And that's the part rattling him most. The documentary didn't merely expose behavior. It revealed a pattern, a mindset, a history the public had only glimpsed in fragments. Now those fragments have been stitched together into something undeniable, and the image isn't flattering. For years, Diddy relied on charm, influence, and sheer force of personality to bend reality, but the doc stripped that armor clean. No lighting, no stage, no edits to soften the edges. Just witnesses, footage, timelines, and a portrait of a man who used access as a shield and intimidation as currency. And here's the real crisis for him. The appeal he's banking on doesn't exist in a vacuum. Judges are human. Public opinion seeps into the air, even when courtrooms pretend to operate above it. The more people watch, the harder it becomes for anyone, lawmakers, officials, potential pardon givers, to distance themselves from the weight of the story. Diddy isn't terrified of the documentary because it's dramatic. He's terrified because it's honest. It shows him without the gloss, without the entourage, without the curated charm. It shows him as he is, not as he marketed himself to be. And that's why he wants it gone. Not because it's defamatory, but because it's definitive. The documentary has become a mirror he spent years avoiding, and now that he's forced to look, he can't blink. You don't send frantic legal letters when you're confident. You send them when you realize the narrative finally slipped out of your hands and landed in front of millions who no longer see you through the old filter. Still with me? Good. Because the moment a man loses control of his myth, he starts revealing the parts of himself he never intended for the world to see. By the time the documentary finishes its final frame, the conversation surrounding Sean Combs stops being about rumors, timing, or courtroom tactics. It becomes a direct confrontation with the version of him the industry worked overtime to protect. The shield is cracked, the narrative is slipping, and the myth he curated for decades is collapsing under the weight of his own footage. That is the part that rattles people the most. Not the testimonies, not the commentary, not even the allegations, but the realization that the most damaging evidence came straight from the man at the center of the storm. No editing trick, no biased narrator, no sensational soundtrack, just him, his behavior, and the legacy he can't outrun anymore. You can almost feel the panic built into every cease and desist he sends out. Those letters aren't power moves, they're distress signals disguised as legal strategy. The documentary didn't misrepresent him, it exposed him exactly as he presented himself when no one thought the footage would surface. And that's why this moment feels so final. He can argue about fairness, he can question motives, he can hire the best crisis managers on the planet, but he can't erase the version of himself he allowed the cameras to capture. The truth isn't arriving from outsiders, it's coming straight from his own archive. What truly shifts the ground is the public response. The audience isn't watching with nostalgia anymore. They're watching with clarity. The rose-colored lens that once surrounded his name shattered the moment he stepped into his own contradictions. Viewers who grew up admiring his work are realizing they admired the art, not the artist, and certainly not the ecosystem that protected him. That shift, that collective break, is irreversible. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you understand the behavior, every old interview, every backstage clip, every unchecked moment hits differently. And the fallout won't be limited to him. Anyone who built their career orbiting his influence will be forced to decide whether they're stepping away or sinking with the ship. Every former associate, every hanger-on, every defender now has to answer a question they've avoided for years. Did they stay silent because they didn't know or because they didn't want to know? That tension is where the next wave of the story lives. Not in the courtroom, not in Hollywood boardrooms, but in the uncomfortable truth that silence was never accidental. The documentary didn't end a chapter. It detonated the lock on a vault he thought would never be opened. And the echoes from that blast are only beginning to travel. Are you still with me? Good, because now we step into the part where public opinion becomes more powerful than any legal team, and the world finally sees what was hiding in plain sight for years. So here we are at the crossroads where a curated legacy meets a reality he can no longer control. The documentary wasn't a takedown, it was a mirror. A mirror he spent decades avoiding, only to find it placed in front of him at a moment when he has the least ability to reshape the reflection. The public is watching with sharpened eyes, the industry is scrambling behind closed doors, and the people who once treated him like an untouchable fixture are realizing they can no longer stand next to the fallout without getting burned. If you've been here the whole time, you already know Fame Insight does not soften the truth. We dissect the story, peel back the layers, and shine a light exactly where the industry hopes you'll never look. And this saga, it's nowhere near finished. More voices will emerge, more footage will surface, more insiders will decide their silence isn't worth the wait anymore. The ground is shifting, and the people trying to hold it together are slipping fast. Before you go, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Fame Insight is pushing toward 10,000, and every new truth seeker counts. If you want the breakdowns without the sugarcoating, the analysis without the PR filter, and the details the mainstream pretends not to see, this is where you belong. Stick around. The next chapter is already unfolding, and trust me, you'll want front row seats.